On the day of Pentecost, the disciples were all together in one place. They weren't scattered out in their houses or grouped in clumps. They were all together in one place. And today, we are all together in one place. And I'm so thankful for it. It's really good to see people, real human bodies, in church. I know all of us feel good to be back in God's house, back with other, our friends, our church family, and worshiping God. It just feels right. It's been a long, long time. It's been a fast that we've had to give up being together for a year in order to be safe. And now we're back. For those of us who have led worship, it's been a drought. Speaking to an empty church, not hearing any responses come back, trying to preach to a camera instead of a person. So we're really glad that finally we're back in church together. On that day of Pentecost, the disciples were all together in one place, and they heard a sound like the rush of a mighty wind. And tongues of fire appeared over the heads of the disciples, and they were filled with the Holy Spirit and began speaking in languages that they didn't even know. And at that time, there were many people in Jerusalem who were pilgrims from all over the Roman Empire who had come to Jerusalem to worship God in the temple and to see the holy city of Jerusalem. There were Parthians and Medes and Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, from Egypt, from the parts of Libya that belonged to Cyrene, from Rome, and there were Cretans and Arabs, people from all over the Roman Empire. That's quite a list. The Parthians and Medes and Elamites were from the countries surrounding Israel, and so they probably had some things in common with the people in Israel, the Jews in Israel, but they had different customs and different cultures. And then you go a little bit further away, the people from Egypt, Jews who were living in Egypt, undoubtedly spoke a different language. They had different culture, different dress in Egypt. Then you go even further to the parts of Libya that were in the control of Cyrene. Libya is North Africa. So we're talking about black-skinned Jews. And then you go to Rome. The Italians in Rome were light-skinned. And there were Cretans and Arabs, people who probably had more of an olive complexion. In other words, there were people of all colors and all cultures there gathered in Jerusalem at that time. And the disciples were raising their voices in praise to God in this house. Now, the way I understand it is the house is sort of situated in the middle of several streets, and being warm, they've got the doors and the windows open. And so as they start to shout and exclaim the praises of God in all these different languages, people around the house can hear them. And they hear their own languages being spoken, which they haven't heard since they left home. And they say, "What is this? These are just ordinary local people. How is it that they're speaking in my language? What does this mean?" And other people, of course, said, "Well, they're just drunk." And Peter got up and made the first speech of his life. Before this, he was just one of Jesus' disciples. But this time, he stands up and he makes his first real speech. And he says, what's happening here is what is prophesied by the prophet Joel. So many years ago, Joel said that in the last days, God will pour his Spirit out on all people. And Your young people, your sons and daughters will prophesy, and your young people will dream dreams, and your old people will see visions, and everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. Well, traditionally, this is known as the beginning of the church, sometimes called the birthday of the church, because no longer would the message of Jesus be confined to a small group right there in Jerusalem, but it's being exploded and sent out into the whole world, into the whole Roman Empire. The message is taken home by all these people who are visiting Jerusalem. It's taken home by Parthians and Medes and Elamites and residents of Mesopotamia and Judea and Cappadocia, and Phrygia and Pamphylia and Pontus and Asia, Egypt, Libya, the city of Rome, Cretans and Arabs. Are all taking the message of Jesus back to their home. So the message is not confined anymore to just people with the same language and skin color and the same culture, but it's being taken out to everyone. It's being taken by black and brown and white people. In other words, God does not know racism. All people are children of God. Everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. Unfortunately, we humans are slow to catch on to this. We humans tend to latch on to the things that divide us instead of the things that we have in common. God sent the Holy Spirit to unite people of all cultures and to make them one, but somehow we have this long history in the world of racism. In our Wednesday night program called Sacred Ground, we've been studying racial reconciliation, and we've been watching videos and reading articles about the history of racism. And I'll tell you, some of those videos are hard to watch because they name some painful realities about slavery and colonization and genocide. It's hard to listen to. And of course, I'd really rather not think about that, you know. All that's in the past. It's done. You know, we didn't do those things. You know, that was our ancestors that did that. It wasn't us. Of course, I know I can't change the past. It's done and gone. But when I look inside, what I see or feel is a little twinge of guilt, because those were my ancestors. I think of my grandmother's family on my father's side. They had a plantation in Louisiana, and they owned slaves. On my mother's side, my great-grandfather was a missionary to the Sioux people, and he brought those Indian children into his mission school and tried to be white instead of Indian. And so I didn't do that, but I still somehow carry that with me in my conscience. I'd rather not think about it. I'd rather just put it aside. But you know, just because you sweep the dust under the rug doesn't mean it goes away. You have folks over to visit and the house is all spick and span, and you say, "Oh, so nice to see you," and everybody's lovely, but you know that dust is still under the rug. It's still there. That's the way it is with history too. 1 year ago, almost exactly a year ago, George Floyd, a black man, was killed by a white officer who kneeled on his neck. It's May 25th. And our bishop has asked us on today, this Sunday, to remember that event and to talk about racism in our churches. So every church in the diocese today is talking about this. And the bishop reminded us of the covenant to root out racism that we endorsed at our diocesan convention in last October, the virtual convention. This covenant is composed of laments and statements of covenant. The laments, there's 11 laments. I won't read them all, but I'll read a couple. We lament the church's role in the subjugation, enslavement, and genocide of societies of indigenous peoples, including Native Americans and Pacific Islanders. Lord, have mercy on us. We lament the church's role in profiting from the selling, trading, and genocide of people of African descent and the lasting effects of the peculiar trade present with us today. And then there's about 17 statements of covenant. Will you covenant to re-examine the history of our communities of faith and institutions, to acknowledge legacies, recognize, remember, and retell the stories of Native American enslaved persons and other people of color whose labor contributes to white privilege? Well, it's on our website. You can download it if you'd like to look at it. It's also on the diocesan website. I don't know if I agree with everything in the covenant, but the point is that the Episcopal Church is doing all it can to work on racial reconciliation. That's the big work of the Episcopal Church today. And I want to be a part of that. And I hope you do too. On the day of Pentecost, the Holy Spirit came down and gave the message of Jesus to people of all nations, people who are black and brown and white. And Peter remembered the words of the prophet Joel, who said, "Everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved." Everyone. Amen.
Amen.